Video where we are going to build ourselves a basic fundamental Boston tone. Now, we're not cork sniffing here. This is the fundamentals. I'm going to show you what I've learned really quickly. You should be able to take this information and jump in and get jamming to some cool Boston tunes. So there's a few things that I think are fundamental here, and I'm going to jump right in. There's actually two EQs in this patch. You'll notice there's none actual EQ blocks, but we're using the input EQ and the output EQ. There's a couple fundamental things about this tone that'll get you in the ballpark. The first is basically there's an EQ before the distortion and there's an EQ after the distortion before the cab. And a compressor just for sustain, right? For crazy sustain. The delay is here just to kind of be fun. You can dial that in. And again, this is a bass tone. We're not doing like the clean tones with the chorus stuff. We're not doing like crazy guitar harmony, like pitch harmonizer stuff, right? In the sample you heard, I double tracked just this bass tone as the lead tone. And that's really all there was. So this will get you in the ballpark. So input EQ and output EQ of the amp. We'll take a look at that. What we've got here, we've got the Plexi 100. We cranked it all the way up. We dimed it. Whether or not this is authentic or accurate to the first record, whatever happened in those Watertown recordings, who actually knows? Again, we're not cork sniffing here. I dialed in a pretty basic, just something to match the Plexi, something that was, I think, pretty much like the stock cabs with a 57-ish, some kind of dynamic mic, and something that's like the stockish cabs that would have come with that 1970 Super Lead 100-watt amp. And I'll just note that I'm running it in stereo mode, the same cab both sides, panned left and right, just because the delay is coming back into the cabinet here, out of the amp into the delay and then into the cab, so the delays are running into the cab. You could do it after the cab if you wanted, but that's the reason the cab is in stereo mode, because I just threw the delays in there in front of the cab. So we've also got a compressor here. Let's take a look at that first. It's pretty aggressive. This is just really to add some sustain. The attack is pretty short. The release time is pretty long. I goosed up the ratio a little bit, and you could play with the threshold. I goosed up the threshold a little bit so that it wouldn't really grab it right away. But anyways, just put a good amount of compression on there so that those single notes hang out there for a little bit longer, and dial that in for your guitar, obviously. So the amp, Plexi 100 watt, we dimed it. The two things here that are going to get us where we want to go. So let's just back that off, and hear just what that amp sounds like. All right, so I've turned off the delay. Just the amp sounds like this. Now that sounds like a dimed Marshall. It doesn't necessarily sound like Boston though, right? What is going on? So this is why the two EQs are so important. They're kind of the key to the tone, I think. Let's do the output EQ first. Now this is, I guess, kind of like a well-known thing. I found this online in my sort of 20 minutes of research. Is a picture of this pedal with this EQ curve, specifically being after the amp. So what I've done here is kind of done the same-ish thing. You'll notice, so basically there's 6 bands here, 100, 200, 400, 800, 1.6K and 3.2K. And it goes, this pedal appears to go up to 18. So this is 0, 9, and 18, and the same thing in the negative direction. Now, in the amp block, you have output EQ built into the amp block. You don't need to add an EQ after the amp. We're using the 7-band variable EQ because the 7-band has the same bands, it just has one higher, a 6.4K. And so the problem here is, the limitation here is it doesn't go all the way up to 18 like that pedal, the MXR pedal does. So I kind of scaled it to the same shape. So it won't be the same amount, but it'll be the same shape. And you'll notice on the curve, there's 400 and there's 800. And we'll come back to the 400 and 800 again later when we look at the input EQ. But this 800 hertz frequency appears to be the thing, the Boston thing. If any one element is the thing, that appears to be it. You want a huge spike on that 800. And so being after the amp, this EQ sort of is what it is. It's not being, there's going to be a lot of high end cut off by the cabinet, but there's no additional harmonic complexity happening after this EQ. This is where, so let me just play a little bit and I'll switch this EQ on and off and you can hear the difference. So the EQ, the output EQ on the amp here is cutting some lows. It's a little muddy in the bass, it's cutting lows. And we're bumping up the 800 hertz, and we're cutting a little bit of highs because that just adds a little bit too much presence to the amp, and we're cutting some at 16 and we're boosting a lot more at 32. I went in here, this was my personal preference. It was getting a little bit screechy for me, and still is a little bit screechy, so I just played with it a little bit and dialed back that 6.4K. That's up to you. You can dial that in to taste. Yeah, so that's the output EQ. That made the biggest difference. Now, there is stories of another EQ here before the amp, and I read a little bit about it's an EQ. I read a little bit about the early record. It was just a wah pedal or a cocked wah pedal for some things. So we're gonna kind of simulate that cocked wah idea on the input EQ. And you'll notice we're doing frequency 400. Why 400? Well, when we push 400 going into the amp, the distortion happening in the amp, you can think of it, without getting into too much technical detail, you can think of it like an extreme form of compression, but it's gonna compress in a way that is musical. You're gonna get more harmonics of the notes going in, and you're gonna get more of the harmonics of that signal coming out than went in. So it's gonna kind of like compress the harmonics of the signal. I'm not explaining it well. But basically, 400 going into the amp is gonna result in more 400 coming out of the amp, but also more 800, right? There's a multiplier that happens during that compression in the amp. So you can dial this in to taste. This is similar to the effect of having a cocked wah. Maybe that just happened to magically be at that right, if they like hearing that 800 hertz, you imagine cocking the wah, sweeping it, finding the right spot. It just happens to be 400-ish, 800-ish, right? That's just what, if you imagine how it might have happened in the studio, that might be how it happened. So you can dial in the amount of gain to taste. Let me, I'll play it without it, and then I'll play it with it. So you can hear the difference. So hopefully you can hear that. That adds a little bit of something. You could maybe even boost it even more. Let's try it, make it even more exaggerated. That's probably too much for me. I played with it, anywhere from 4 dB, 6 dB, 8 dB, somewhere around there. 8 dB seemed fine to me. So I'm gonna leave it there in the preset that I'll upload to Axe Exchange. Yeah, and then, so that gives us kind of what you've heard, and then I just added a little bit of stereo tape delay here, and we get some fun stuff. Fun stuff. Let me know in the comments if you are a Boston fan. I love Boston. My dad was a big Boston fan, and he kind of imprinted that on me. Let me know if you get to this sound another way, or if I missed a trick so far, or if this was helpful to you. If you made it this far in the video, I really, really do appreciate it. And remember, if it sounds good, it is good.